But the shock was still with Osrith. Had she not done all the work to get these men, 3 very young and 2 rather older and inexperienced, to be excellent soldiers? And when the battle is done, you may return to your men, Aldhelm added. He looked briskly at Elfgar and added, please bring Osrith's belongings to her. Everything I own I have with me, Osrith said, hoping that her tone was not too grudging, and she nodded to Elfgar. Make sure Ossier does his share, for he has a tendency to loaf if left. And see that Elfwin has a new jerkin, he has grown since he was last clothed. With a salute, Elfgar and Miriel marched away, and Osrith looked across to Aldhelm, who was looking down his long nose to her. He does not trust other men to be around her, he confided softly, so as not to be overheard. And it suddenly became clear to Osrith what properties meant, as she followed Aldhelm to Ethelred's tent. Ethelfled was alone, for it seemed that, temporarily, the job of guarding her had been left to Aldhelm. I do not need guarding, Ethelfled complained, when Aldhelm had left. Osrith found a place inside the tent to stand, so she could see outside, so she could be aware of danger near the edges of the tent, so she could see Ethelfled, to ensure she did nothing which compromised her own safety. After a time of pacing around her tent, Ethelfled giving her side looks as she paced, her face on the near side yellow with old injuries, she folded her arms and glared at Osrith. Do not let him beat you, lady, Osrith said, bluntly. Ethelfled opened her eyes in amazement that she had spoken and strode over to her. How dare you deign to speak to me? I dare because I have been given the responsibility to guard you, to protect you, Osrith replied. And if you can protect yourself, that will be one less thing I have to do. And, before her eyes, the defiant, angry lady of the Mersons turned her face from Osrith. Her shoulders began to sag, and then move up and down. She was crying. My lady, Osrith managed, after a few swift steps towards her, placing a comforting hand on her back which, to Osrith's surprise, Ethelfled did not shrug away. I can teach you, should you wish. Why? Ethelfled asked, through quiet, whimpering sobs. Why would you? Why should women not protect themselves? Mercia is not Wessex, lady. You can make your own mark here, as the lady of the Mersons. Osrith bent closer to her ear. I have seen you fight against Steeper. Some of the men I fight beside in this army would die of shock if they were half as good as you were then. And, I expect you are better. Ethelfled's sobs ebbed to nothing, and she drew away from Osrith, crossing to her belongings and picking up a comb, with which she neatened her hair. Nothing she had could take away the signs of her abuse, however. Then, the lady of the Mersons turned to Osrith. She expected Ethelfled to order her away, but she did not. What she did do was something Osrith did not expect. Show me, train me, she implored, in an urgent, low hiss. I have need of it. So she did, thought Osrith. You are very good, cool-headed, you make a plan, you stick to it. My father remarked upon it. What could she say? Osrith thought later. She could not refuse a plea from a lady for protection, especially if King Alfred rated her abilities. After all, my lady, begin by building your strength, Osrith advised. You cannot begin to work on blade skill without eating well. Can you do that? But, nothing could come of the plan just then, for Ethelred entered the tent. He nodded at Osrith with a cursory glance, then batted his hand away from her. I am to leave, my lord. Yes, go, he snapped. As Osrith trod towards the cool night air, she turned, as a movement caught the corner of her eye. Ethelred has hit his wife, though she had made no noise when she was struck. At that moment, all anger that she had felt towards the woman dissolved and, had he not been her sworn lord, Osrith might have attacked Ethelred, for Ethelfled not pushed him back. She must show her, Osrith thought, as she stood beside the tent, disgust flooding her stomach, and she waited in the darkness, an empty feeling in her chest, as the realization she was not going to her men, to be their captain, left her. A group of men laughed and joshed their way along the line of tent, their mirth filling the air, her brother amongst them. Osrith watched them heading away from the camp, presumably for some night's entertainment, and wondered when she would be back in charge of them. But all thoughts of her captaincy came to a bone-shuddering, heart-racing halt as desire crept over Osrith's body and made her breathe deep. She had seen the man on Utad's right-hand side. Christ was on God's right hand in heaven. He was dear to her brother as he walked beside him. Finan Osrith dearly wanted to talk to him, by all that was holy she did, but it risked weakness to her position. Fantasy, and 10 minutes with her own fingers would have to suffice. Perhaps it was her staring that had caught their attention, however, and to Osrith's dismay her brother was marching over to her as she stood away from the royal tent. "I thought you were supposed to be guarding the lady," Utad said, accusingly. "She is with her husband. Lord Ethliad ordered me to leave. I do not think that they would wish me to stay there for that." Osrith hoped her face showed the defiance that she felt, but the interval was longer than she anticipated before Utad stepped back. She turned to look to her brother's right-hand man. "Thank you for saving my life in Winchester." "The water wasn't deep enough to drown in," Finan replied. "I was just helping you along." Just helping you along. That was one of his phrases. He would say that a lot, and Osrith would notice his shrugging off of difficult things, or when he was shown gratitude as, "just helping you along." Morantain, she added, for good measure. Utad had begun to walk off, but Finan didn't, and stood in front of Osrith. "So, you are in the Mercen army now?" Behind her brother, Osrith thought she saw Sihik and Osferth bend their heads towards them to catch any words they could, as Utad stalked past them. "I was recommended to Mercia," Osrith replied, trying to not let her bitterness enter her tone, although there was not much to be bitter about, when she had a position which was eminently advantageous to her. Finan bent a little lower, and put a hand by his mouth. "Elswith would have something to do with it, no doubt," he confided. "Alfred liked his women when he was younger." "But, I am," she broke off as Finan grinned. "You are," he agreed, and Osrith laughed at the thought, for they had never heard that of Alfred before. "I never would have guessed, not the king of the West Saxons," she replied. "So, why are you here? Is it the air, or something?" "It's not as good as Alba," Osrith admitted. "No," she continued, sinking down onto one of the baggage carts. "The Mercen army are not as picky as the West Saxon army is." Finan sat beside her, though with a socially appropriate distance between them, and smiled at her. "Oh, I don't know, they let Utad fight for them, so they do." Despite herself, Osrith smiled. "Mercia is losing many men on the frontier of Daneland, and I am good at what I do." "A woman leader?" Finan pressed. "You should know more than anyone. Are you not of Arion? A woman can be Druid, a woman can be Olam, a woman can be a soldier. But you are of Alba." It was a statement, and told Osrith that there was a second man with whom she had spoken who remembered things. "I was raised in Alba, certainly. I came into the service of a king. I can fight." "I know," Finan agreed. "I've seen you." And it was then that Osrith remembered that he resembled someone she knew. Only then, she could not place it. She would not be able to place it for a long time. An owl hooted, and the feeling that she must be more formal with a lord's man settled upon her. "Oidgmuth," Osrith said, bluntly, and got to her feet. When Finan got up too, she raised a hand. He looked at her palm, and Osrith knew he had seen her scar. Quickly, she drew it back, and nodded towards Lord Ethliad's tent. "Shiare," Finan called to her, before going back to camp. 88,888,888. "You are joking if you think that woman has any feelings for you." Utad was lying in his own tent, with his men beside him, discussing the evening. Finan, a little way from him, ankles folded and arms behind his head, stared up to the canvas, thinking, "She stares at me when she thinks I'm not looking." Utad replied, "I have seen her look away when I look at her." "Means nothing," Finan replied. "I'm tellin' ye, she may hate you as much as like you." He watched his friend turn to his other warriors. "Are ye just a wee bit drunk, Lord?" Utad ignored him and turned to his other warriors. "Clapper, Sihrik, what do you think?" The young warrior shrugged his shoulders as the older man grunted, having not heard the question. "I cannot say, Lord," he replied, noncommittally. Utad looked across to Osferth, who shook his head. "She doesn't look like she likes you, Lord, not to me, Anyway, she's almost annoying as you, Utad grumbled. So that's it, Finan asked. Because she shows no interest in ye, and she annoys ye, you want to wind her up? Well, Utad said, springing to his feet. I'm going to find out. What? Finan was roused from his state of quiet, easy contemplation at the outrageousness of his friend's suggestion. He sat up and peered at Utad. But, you have a wife, he accused. And besides, that just isn't very. He broke off as a huge grin spread across Utad's face and he got to his feet. Utad, she spent a long time being harassed by Ethwold, if you recall. Finan reminded his friend. Just a bit of fun, Finan, my old friend, come and watch. He clapped Finan on the back. I will do no such thing. Finan replied, hotly. Have you thought what could happen if you do that? What if what you say is true? You're coming, are you not, Sihrik? Osfath? Utad nodded his head towards Finan, and winked. Sihrik sheathed his seeks which he was polishing and got up too. The shame that he had felt that Osrith might have usurped his position in Elfber's heart enough to watch her being annoyed by Utad. He also understood his lord's meaning when Finan folded his arms and looked annoyed. You too, baby monk? Finan looked at Osfath with disappointment. Aren't there rules about this sort of thing? Thou shalt not play tricks on people. Nothing that I've heard of, Osfath said, catching Utad's eye. Finan sighed deeply. I suppose someone with a bit of sense had better come with you, Lord, he added. That's if you can find her. 88,888,888. But Osrith was not where she had been, in the proximity of Ethlierd's tent, because she had seen someone who she had made a promise to herself about, and was now following Father Buku across the field and to the larger tent that was being used as a church. He pushed the cloth to the church aside with one of his large hands as if swatting a particularly large insect. Behind him, Osrith stepped in after him and stood by the entrance, waiting for him to come out of his thoughts which were so clearly occupying him, enough for him to begin pacing at the anxiety in his mind. Osrith's heart lurched, for she remembered him doing this sometimes in Bibbenberg's chapel at times when her uncle Elfric had given him an ethically dubious task to do. May I confess, Father? Osrith asked, when he first noticed her standing there. Whatever his preoccupation had been, Boka smiled and nodded. Yes, my child, he said. Come, kneel beside the altar and I will hear you confession. Had Utad decided to search the for Osrith instead of being in amongst the people dining in a makeshift hall, he might have heard all his sister had to say, and their history might have been different. But he hadn't, and was now enjoying a second supper and ale with his warriors instead, and the conversation had gone from Ethlierd's newest guard to how many West Saxons would be alive at the end of the battle in London compared to how many Mersons. Osrith trod gently towards the wooden table draped with a finely embroidered linen cloth. She closed her eyes, trying to steady herself, for her nerve was very fine. Then, as Bika began the first prayer, she opened hers again and looked at the priest, once Bibbenberg's priest, who had given her all the guidance, love and direction that she had ever had from anyone else. Did Elfric send you a message that I was dead? For a moment, Osrith thought he hadn't heard her. He had lifted his head and was looking at her, as if waiting for her to bow her head again. Then, Boku opened his mouth wide, as if searching for something to say. And then, not long ago I read ... I saw your name ... Edra? Osrith didn't respond immediately, for the name seemed from a place long ago and far away. Then she nodded, not caring that tears were easing their way down her cheeks. Edra. Oh my dear child. He made to put his arms around her, and did so softly, as if she might break. Congratulations, Father, Osrith said, to steady her emotions. Your marriage? Oh, yes, that, Boka said, dismissively, getting to his feet. Yes. We got married. He looked at her as if she were still a dream. But you? Osrith got up too. I escaped from my uncle, once I knew of my fate. She was a little gratified to see that he looked a little ashamed, for Osrith knew that Bika knew of Elfric's intentions, and had left for Winchester in any case. But then Osrith dropped to her knees again. I need to confess, Father, she said again. Will you take my confession? Bika's eyes were shining, but he nodded and knelt beside Osrith, and confessed she did, starting with her theft of the boat and the silver from Bibbenberg, to her pride at her career in the Mercen army, and all of the things in between. She had been in the company of a Norseman, escaped from the betrothal of herself to Guthard, fornicated with the king of Alba's son. This did cause a good deal of blushing to go to Bicker's face when she recounted what she had done in his company. Osrith even told him of Tagged, who she had intended to marry, and live well, as a warrior. His eyes narrowed a good deal when she told him of her dealings with the Healer Britons, but Osrith did not elaborate on what she had bought from Beathu and Bark, or its purpose. Edra, Boker said at length, you have confided in me, and only God has the ability to forgive you. It must have taken a good deal of courage to come to me tonight. Do you repent all you have told me? Yes, Father. Then, the Lord will forgive you for these sins. But tell me. Bicker got up again, and Osrith followed. You were not Edra when you came to sit in the palace chapel. When I left Bibbenberg, I chose a different name, the name of one of my ancestors, King Oswy's daughter Osrith. It was the truth. But now standing before Bicker, in the relative safety of the Mercen army, it sounded lame. Ah, Osrith, Bicker repeated, I do remember your name, and now, look at you, a fully grown woman, and a warrior, and no one to guide you. I'm 16, Father, Osrith replied, earnestly, or at least, I think I am. And you're wrong. You have been by my side. Bicker looked very confused. But Osrith smiled, as she remembered her thrill each time she had found his small, neat handwriting. You sent letters to the monks living in the monastery at Culdees. I read them. You guided me to Utard, to Wessex. I read your letters, in Doyle, in Kells. You did all that? And then Bicker broke out into a huge smile, and put his arms out to Osrith, and she fell into them. It was so good to get her secrets off her chest. At length, Boker stepped back and looked at her face. God had planned this. God saw to it that you knew where I was, Edra. Osrith is my name now, she reminded him. And are you baptized of it? Osrith shook her head. Then you must. Your mother made you to be rebaptized, Boker told her. Osrith smiled. I know. You told me. After you tell Utard. Oh child. It is so good to see you after all this time. But Osrith took a step back. She suspected Bicker would say this to her, to mention her brother, and she felt cold at the suggestion. But the priest was pressing on, and he was looking over her form. But, a warrior, Edra? The army is not a place for a woman. Why? Osrith asked. I have no fear. I never fear anything in battle. God has chosen this in me. It is better than being wed to Sven Kjartansson. Yes, it is. But Osrith shook her head, sadly. I will not be telling him. Bicker. I joined the Mercen Guard for a reason, to become a person in my own right. Besides, I have seen how he treats people, heard of his actions. He is a pagan. He believes in God in his heart, Bicker replied, and Osrith thought, he truly believes that. I saw him. Once, Osrith pressed on. He came to Bibbenberg with my uncle's man's head, and swore to avenge him. This was after you left, Father, she added, and saw that Bicker flinched again, at the mention of him leaving. So Brit, he left a boat in the Seagate. I escaped. Osrith rubbed her scar on her left hand. Sometimes she could still feel the pain of the arrow through it. And she told him of Dunnottar and Iona, of Doyle, Kells and Tara, and her watch Imga King make 2 kingdoms into one. Ethlier does not want that, Osrith concluded. He does not want to be subsumed like the Strathclydians, into one land under one king. Osrith stopped, because Bicker was just staring at her. But I will be baptized with my new name, if you think it right. And she stopped talking, and waited for Boker's words. All this time, he mused quietly, then added, louder, I rarely see you in church. I do come, Osrith admitted. I think my faith is different. The church is different in Irian. Bicker nodded his head. I was brought through the Irish church, he said, at the monastery in Melrose, where I was left. Osrith gasped. Abandoned? By your parents? Yes, for whatever reason. And they tolerated the Irish monks there. They prayed a great deal. and took on a lot of trials. Come. He beckoned Osrith through to the section of the church at the back. Clearly a living space for him and Thyra. A bed was propped up with wood near the floor with furs laid nearly on it. At one side a trunk sat, with books near it, and a parchment was on top, as if the priest had been interrupted writing it. The Irish church, Bicca mused, as he closed the trunk lid. I know a priest, a warrior, who would love to meet you, Osrith, although, on second thoughts, his voice trailed off, and then he turned back to Osrith. Of course, you cannot remain in the army, Osrith, Bicca said, quickly, his eyes darting from left to right. Then he looked at her. I can find you someone to marry, who will accept all you have done, as befitting a lady of Northumbria. But Osrith was on her feet and striding towards the church. Wait. Where are you going? Bicca reached for her shoulder, and she turned. Osrith felt her heart beating in her chest. What did she expect? That Father Bocca, her parent in all but the physical sense, would let her go on as she was. Anger flared in Osrith's chest, anger at herself. Returning to my duty, Osrith said, stiffly. But Bicca had somehow put himself between Osrith and the exit. Does he know this? Does he know about you? When she said nothing, Bicca added, Utid number. Then, he continued, but paused, then smiled and nodded. Our home is yours, while I make arrangements. But Osrith shook her head. I fear for you, after all you have told me. Bicca shouted, and Bicca's shouting was enough to make Osrith turn quickly to him. Fear of a little child in her chest, her heart beating. She had been scolded. Why? I have fought, I have killed ... I have killed Norse, I was beside Prince Domnall, who is now king of Alba as he killed Var. But Bicca was beside her, his face imploring, and Osrith felt her heart sink when he urged, Utid must know. Why? I have seen my brother, father, Osrith said, steadily. I know him through his actions, torn between lives, Saxon and Dane, Christian and pagan. This will be the death of him or, if not him, others. He has a sister, a Danish adopted sister, now my wife. He risked so much for her, Bicca replied. But his first wife, abandoned, murder of the Britons of Cornwall, and his current wife is a pagan? Osrith shook her head. He is too conflicted, father. I would only add to his confusion. And it was at that point that Bicca nodded, sadly. Aethliad is all I need, his army, that is. Then stay, Bicca said, stay close by. Osrith ... Edra, he asked. Only if you accept I am no one's responsibility but my own, Osrith asked, and Bicca nodded, before embracing her, as if he still didn't truly believe she was there. Osrith trod the moist earth back to Aethliad's tent, only to find that Miral had taken her place. Rest, and you can continue to guard the Lady Ethelfled tomorrow, Miral said. You may rest with your men, with Ulfgar, should you wish. Osrith wished, pleased that her position had not been taken from her, and her heart lightened. How could Bicca ever think that she would accept his making arrangements for marriage for her, or that he should think she should tell Utid that he was her brother, only for him to have the responsibility instead. Osrith was her own person, and would never accept a husband, who would limit and control her. Like Ethelflaed's, Utid had indeed been drunk when he suggested that they find Osrith and annoy her, and after more drink, his men had got very tipsy very quickly, and he had left them in the large tent which was catering for the army to go to speak to Stipe about the next day's plan. So, he hadn't banked on seeing Osrith cross the fields in the dusklight, with a determined pace heading towards the army tents. It was an opportunity too good to miss against the stuck-up woman, and it was within seconds that he had pushed her towards the spinney of larch trees that formed a partial barrier between the army and the nobles. Seeks at her throat. Utid grinned at her outrage. What are you doing here, girl? He asked, trying to get her expression to register fear. But Osrith only looked at Utid in defiance. I am no girl, I am a warrior. She spat back, and wriggled against him, to try to free herself from Utid's grip, but he held the blade tighter, watching fury enter her eyes as he trailed a hand over her chest. A silver piece says you are, he murmured, ale on his breath, and Osrith struggled, for the most part, a useless gesture as Utad pressed his body against hers, watching for this action now to provoke her. What his alcohol-dulled senses did not expect, however, was Osrith swinging a punch, throwing all her weight behind it into his stomach while at the same time taking the wrist of his hand holding the blade and biting down with all her might. Ah! Utad screamed, the pain unexpected, and he reeled away from Osrith, only to turn back and give her a ferocious look. Ah! My intention was not. He trailed off, shaking his hand again. Do not look at me how you look at Athelflaed. Osrith roared at him, though quite why she had chosen those words to throw at him. Clutching Bue's handle, she added, touch me again and it will be the last thing you do. She ducked as a punch came, and Utad was left massaging his hand as it had landed with force on bark, not her face. He was furious now, and made a grab for her, but Osrith pounced towards his legs, bringing him down. She was just about to land a hefty punch to his face when hands brought her to her feet. What is going on here? It was Beka, and he was having to hold her back with all his might to prevent Osrith from flying at Utad again. Leave me, she shouted, glowering at Utad, who was trying to get up from the ground. I will have him. I could kill him. You could not Utad. Beka's voice was soft, as if trying to soothe her, but his words only caused to volatilize her anger. I have killed Norse, Picts, and Gales too. But not Utad, Beka continued, softly. He will never be beaten. Osrith dragged herself from the priest's grip and drew Bue. That threat only has to be proved wrong once. She shot back. Beka stood silently where he was, for Bue's tip looked sharp. Then a voice called behind them. Beka? What is this? The speaker, neared them, then gasped when she saw her husband at sword point. It's Osrith, my love, Beka replied, and stepped away as the woman stood between Beka and Osrith. And she, Utad? She is showing how much she hates the bastard, Osrith thought, not taking her eyes off her brother. I have no doubt there was a disagreement, Thyra Ragnarsdotter replied, her eyes looking at Osrith as Beka shooed Utad away. Utad got to his feet, determined not to be shooed, and saw Beka's face. He picked up his sword, and then with his chin in the air, stalked back off to his tent, with the nobles. Osrith stared at Thyra, who she had seen before, at Ethelflaed's wedding, and dropped her sword, pushing Bue back into her scabbard. Hatred, the Danish woman whispered. Hatred? Asked Beka. My love. This is Osrith. But Thyra spoke again, her eyes willing Osrith never to look away. I was imprisoned once, by a man named Sven, she began. Sven one eye, uttered Osrith, while beside her, Beka tried to quieten his wife, but Thyra was unmoved. She looked at Osrith curiously. How do you know? But Osrith said nothing and Thyra decided to go on. I had hatred enough, then, but I learned to let it go. Thyra looked in the direction that Utad had stalked. Osrith glanced at Beka, whose face shone ready honesty and was having trouble believing Osrith felt such a way to Utad, his long-held image of them being happy together as siblings fast evaporating like mist under a sun's glare. But there was something in the softness of the Danish woman's voice, her wise voice, and Osrith knew then that it must have been she, Thyra, who had gone in place of herself to Sven to suffer hideously for so many years. It was all Osrith could do than to hug the woman and thank her for buying Osrith her own freedom with her captivity. What wrong was it my brother did to you? Thyra's voice was soft, beguiling, but Osrith still had her own will, and she chose silence. Nothing whatever, Osrith replied, glancing at Thyra, nodding a thank you to her. Indeed, nothing, Thyra confirmed, gleaning all she needed to know from Osrith's demeanor. That you are safe, now, with Father Beka, is good, Osrith concluded, forcing calmness into her demeanor, as if their meeting was the other way round. Wait, Beka called, as Osrith turned to go. She sighed, and turned back to him. I am going to rejoin my men or I will be on privy duty for 2 nights if I am late to my duty in the morning. And Osrith turned and went now, over to the army, scanning the different bands of men, focusing hard on where they were, as if their campfire told her instantly where they were. Osrith, Beka shouted, but she did not turn, not even once, missing Thyra's look of astonishment that Beacon knew her. I am gone to Mercia, Osrith thought, as she spotted a figure which very much looked like Elfrith, and I should never return to Wessex. 88,888,888. And Elfgar moved over, relinquishing his temporarily held position as captain of this band of men. All 5 of the men stood when they saw her, and she nodded to each of them. Good to see you, Osrith, a voice came from behind her as she sat next to Elfgar, looking at the stew, probably rabbit, for Elfkin was amazing at watching and trapping them. She turned and Elfrith passed her a chunk of grey bread. You've come back to us then? You've murdered the Lady Ethelfled? Osrith laughed, getting back to her feet and clapping her friend on the back. It's good to see you, she exclaimed. Are you keeping my men in order? He said if we don't work hard to be the best fighters in the Mercen army, he will feed us to the monsters in the river. Elfkin's eyes were wide open and Osrith smiled. True, she replied, sinking back down again. But that will never happen, Elfkin, will it? The young boy shook his head. I can disarm Oshir, he said, proudly. Then, I'll put you right at the end so you can disarm all of the cowardly, stupefying Danes, Osrith replied, ruffling his hair. But Elfkin would not be fighting, he would be being left behind at the camp with the women. So why are you back? Elfgar asked, as he spooned stew into a wooden bowl for her. Can't abide rich food, Osrith replied. Gets stuck in my throat. She shook her head. No, she admitted, I was dismissed for the night from the Lady Ethelfled's guard by the Lord Ethliard, she told them, so, I came back for the night.